November 3rd, 1968. A Sunday night in Harlem. The kind of night where the air felt heavy, where the streetlights cast long shadows that seemed to move on their own, where every corner whispered secrets that could get a man killed. Inside a brownstone on West 112th Street, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in his study, a glass of cognac untouched on the mahogany desk in front of him. He was 63 years old. His hands, once quick enough to pull a trigger before a man could blink, trembled slightly now. Age was catching up, but his mind remained sharp as a straight razor. He'd built an empire that spanned decades, survived wars with the Italian mob, outlasted federal investigations, and earned respect from men who respected nothing. But empires don't crumble from outside attacks. They rot from within. At that exact moment, 7 blocks away, a young man named Frank Lucas was making a phone call that would dismantle everything Bumpy had built. Not with bullets, not with bombs, with information. With betrayal so calculated, so precise, that within 7 days, the most powerful black crime organization in New York City would be bleeding out, and the man who'd been treated like a son would be standing on top of the corpse, smiling. What Bumpy didn't know, as he sat in that study listening to Miles Davis drift through the speakers, was that his protege had already sold him out. The phone call had been made, the trap was set, and time was running out. Harlem in 1968 was a powder keg wrapped in jazz music and revolutionary rhetoric. Martin Luther King had been assassinated that April. Cities across America had burned. The Black Panthers were arming themselves. The Vietnam War was grinding young men into dust. And in the streets, heroin was spreading like a plague, turning neighborhoods into graveyards. Bumpy Johnson had controlled the drug trade in Harlem for over a decade. But he operated by a code. He kept it contained. He didn't sell to kids. He didn't let it destroy the community completely. He paid off cops, politicians, and FBI agents with the precision of a man who understood that power wasn't about violence. It was about knowing who to corrupt and when. But Frank Lucas didn't believe in codes. He believed in money. And he was tired of operating in Bumpy's shadow. Frank Lucas was 38 years old in 1968. He'd come up from North Carolina 15 years earlier, with nothing but ambition and a willingness to do things other men wouldn't. Bumpy had taken him under his wing, taught him the game, showed him how to move in a world that would chew up and spit out anyone who didn't understand the rules. Frank learned fast, too fast. He watched how Bumpy controlled the supply chains, how he negotiated with the Italian families, how he kept federal heat off the operation by spreading money in the right places. And while he watched, Frank started building his own network. Quietly, carefully. He made connections Bumpy didn't know about. He traveled to Bangkok and cut deals directly with suppliers in the Golden Triangle, bypassing the Italian middlemen who'd been taking cuts for decades. He called his product Blue Magic, and it was purer and cheaper than anything on the streets. But he couldn't go full scale, not while Bumpy was alive and in control. So Frank started planning something that required patience and precision. He started planning to remove Bumpy without firing a single shot. The relationship between Bumpy and Frank had always been complicated. Bumpy saw Frank as the son he never had. Frank saw Bumpy as the old man standing between him and an empire. They ate together, talked strategy together. Bumpy introduced Frank to people who mattered, gave him access to rooms where deals were made, and Frank smiled, nodded, played the loyal soldier. But behind that smile was a mind calculating every angle, every weakness, every opportunity. By late 1968, Bumpy's health was failing. He'd had a heart attack the previous year. The doctors told him to slow down, but slowing down meant losing control, and losing control in Harlem meant dying. So Bumpy kept pushing, kept managing the operation, kept believing that Frank would take over when the time came and honor everything they'd built. He was wrong. The phone call Frank made on November 3rd wasn't to a rival gang or a hitman. It was to a federal agent named Richie Roberts. Roberts was part of a new task force that was targeting heroin distribution in New York. He was honest, which was rare. He couldn't be bought, which made him dangerous. And he was obsessed with taking down the drug networks that were destroying the city. Frank had been watching Roberts for months. He'd studied the cases Roberts worked, the methods he used, the pressure he was under to produce results. And Frank realized something brilliant and ruthless. If he gave Roberts information on Bumpy's operation, Names, locations, supply routes, payment schedules. Roberts would have no choice but to move on it. And when federal agents started kicking down doors and seizing product, the Italian families who supplied Bumpy would assume he'd gotten sloppy. They'd cut him off. The cops and politicians on Bumpy's payroll would scatter like rats, afraid of being caught in a federal investigation. And in the chaos, Frank could step in, present himself as the solution, the new blood with new connections and a cleaner operation. It was brilliant. It was cold. It was betrayal elevated to an art form. The first domino fell on November 5th, 2 days after Frank's phone call. Federal agents raided a warehouse in the South Bronx that Bumpy used to store processed heroin before distribution. They seized 200 kilograms of product worth over $3 million on the street. They arrested 4 of Bumpy's lieutenants. The raid was surgical. They knew exactly where to go, exactly when to hit, exactly who would be there. Bumpy got the call at 3 a.m. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening to one of his men explain what had happened, and he knew immediately. This wasn't random. This wasn't a lucky bust. Someone had talked. Someone close. He started making calls, trying to figure out where the leak was, but the phone lines suddenly felt dangerous. He didn't know who to trust anymore, and that's exactly what Frank had counted on. The second domino fell on November 7th. The Italian supplier that Bumpy had worked with for 15 years, a capo in the Lucchese family named Carmine Tramunti, called a meeting. Bumpy drove to a restaurant in Little Italy, the kind of place where wise guys ate pasta and discussed murder over wine. Carmine didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told Bumpy the heat was too intense. The feds were sniffing around, asking questions, and Carmine's bosses didn't want any part of an operation that was compromised. Effective immediately, the supply was cut off. Bumpy tried to negotiate, offered more money, promised to find the leak and plug it, but Carmine shook his head. The decision was made. Bumpy walked out of that restaurant knowing he'd just lost his lifeline. Without product, he couldn't operate. Without operating, he couldn't pay his people. And without his people, he had nothing. He was 63 years old, sick, and suddenly vulnerable in a world that devoured weakness. Frank moved on November 9th. He called a meeting with Bumpy's remaining lieutenants at a social club on Lenox Avenue. These were men who'd worked for Bumpy for years, men who'd been loyal. But loyalty has a price, and when Frank walked into that room and laid out what he had, direct connections to Southeast Asian suppliers, product that was better and cheaper than anything Bumpy could get, and most importantly, no federal heat, those men started listening. Frank told them Bumpy was finished, told them the old man's time had passed, told them they could keep going down with him or they could get on board with the future. He didn't threaten, didn't need to. The math was simple. Bumpy couldn't supply them. Frank could. By the end of that meeting, 6 of Bumpy's top men had switched sides. Just like that. Years of loyalty evaporated because Frank had played the game smarter, colder, and with a brutality that masqueraded as business sense. Bumpy found out about the defection on November 10th. One of the few men still loyal to him came to his brownstone and told him what had happened. Bumpy sat in his study, the same room where he'd sat a week earlier, and he finally understood. He understood that Frank had orchestrated everything. The federal raids, the loss of supply, the defections. It had all been Frank. The boy he'd mentored, the man he'd trusted, had systematically dismantled his empire in 7 days. Bumpy didn't rage, didn't scream, didn't threaten revenge. He just sat there staring at the wall, and something in him broke. Not his body, his spirit. He'd survived prison, assassination attempts, gang wars, and federal investigations. But he couldn't survive this. He couldn't survive being betrayed by the person he'd loved like a son. On November 11, Bumpy Johnson had a heart attack, a massive one. He collapsed in the hallway of his brownstone, clutching his chest, unable to breathe. The doctors at Harlem Hospital tried to save him, but his heart had taken too much damage over too many years. He died at 4:47 in the morning, surrounded by machines and strangers. Frank Lucas wasn't there. He was across town, meeting with his new lieutenants, planning distribution routes, calculating profits. When someone told him Bumpy was dead, Frank nodded, expressed condolences, and went back to work. There was no guilt in his eyes, no remorse, just the cold recognition that a problem had solved itself. The funeral was held on November 16. Hundreds of people showed up, musicians, hustlers, shopkeepers, politicians, cops on the take. Everyone who'd known Bumpy or benefited from his protection came to pay respects. Frank Lucas was there too, standing in the back, wearing a black suit and a solemn expression. He shook hands, accepted condolences, played the grieving protege perfectly. And as Bumpy's casket was lowered into the ground, Frank was already running Harlem. He'd taken over every operation, every connection, every territory. The empire Bumpy had built over 30 years now belonged to the man who'd destroyed him. And the most terrifying part was how easy it had been. One phone call, 7 days, and a legend was erased. Frank Lucas would go on to build his own empire. He'd become one of the richest, most powerful drug dealers in American history. He'd smuggle heroin in the coffins of dead soldiers coming back from Vietnam. He'd make millions. He'd live like royalty. But his reign wouldn't last. The same ruthlessness that let him betray Bumpy would eventually turn on him. In 1975, Frank would be arrested by the same federal agent he'd once used as a weapon against Bumpy. Richie Roberts would take him down with the same precision Frank had used to take down Bumpy. And Frank would spend the next decades in prison, informing on everyone he'd ever worked with, trying to reduce his sentence by betraying people the same way he'd betrayed the man who'd treated him like family. Karma, it turned out, had a long memory and perfect aim. The streets of Harlem never forgot what Frank Lucas did. Older hustlers, the ones who'd known Bumpy, they talked about it in barbershops and bars. They talked about how Frank had smiled in Bumpy's face while sharpening the knife he'd plant in his back. They talked about how the empire Bumpy built with honor and strategy had been stolen by a man who understood that loyalty was just another commodity to be traded. And they taught the younger generation a lesson that Bumpy had learned too late. Trust is the most dangerous weapon in the underworld, because the people closest to you, the ones you teach and protect and love, they're the ones who know exactly where to strike when they decide you're in their way. The days following Bumpy's funeral felt like watching a city forget its history in real time. Frank Lucas moved through Harlem with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, consolidating power, restructuring operations, erasing Bumpy's fingerprints from an organization that had been built on his vision. He changed suppliers, renegotiated territories, cut out anyone who showed even a flicker of loyalty to the old guard. Within 2 weeks, it was as if Bumpy Johnson had never existed. The social clubs where Bumpy had held court were now Frank's. The enforcers who'd once carried out Bumpy's orders now answered to Frank. The money that had flowed through channels Bumpy had carefully constructed for decades now poured into Frank's accounts. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a natural succession, and the speed of it left people reeling. But there were cracks in Frank's foundation that he didn't see yet. Or maybe he saw them and didn't care. The older generation, the ones who'd walked with Bumpy through the wars of the 40s and 50s, they didn't accept Frank. They couldn't. Men like Junie Bird and Nat Pettigrew, street legends in their own right, watched Frank's rise with disgust. They knew what he'd done. They'd pieced together the timeline, connected the federal raids to Frank's sudden abundance of product, understood that Bumpy's heart attack had been triggered by stress that Frank had deliberately engineered. These men were in their 60s and 70s now, too old to fight a war, too smart to make a move they couldn't win. But they remembered. And in Harlem, memory was a kind of currency. They started talking, not openly, not in ways that would get back to Frank, but in quiet conversations over chess games and card tables. They made sure the younger hustlers knew the truth. They made sure the story of Frank's betrayal became part of Harlem's oral history, passed down like folklore, a warning encoded in narrative. Frank's operation grew faster than anyone had predicted. His Blue Magic brand flooded the streets, and because it was purer than anything else available, it created a new generation of addicts. Junkies who'd built up tolerances to diluted product suddenly found themselves overdosing on Frank's gear. Emergency rooms in Harlem hospitals started seeing 5, 10, 15 overdoses a night. Bodies showed up in alleys, in abandoned buildings, in the bathrooms of tenement apartments. Young men and women, barely in their 20s, dead with needles still in their arms. Frank didn't care. He'd abandoned whatever pretense of community concern Bumpy had maintained. Bumpy had been a gangster, yes, but he'd also been a man of Harlem. He'd funded churches, helped families pay rent, made sure kids had Christmas presents. It had been part pragmatism, keeping the community on his side, and part genuine affection for the place that had made him. Frank saw all of that as weakness. He saw sentiment as bad business. So he took the money and lived like a king while the neighborhood that had produced him rotted from the inside. By 1969, Frank Lucas was untouchable, or so he thought. He'd bought a mansion in New Jersey, drove a fleet of luxury cars, wore custom suits that cost more than most people in Harlem made in a year. He started bringing his family up from North Carolina, setting them up in nice houses, showing off his wealth like it was a badge of honor. And that's where he made his first real mistake. Bumpy had understood the importance of invisibility. He dressed modestly, lived in Harlem, moved through the streets like he was just another hustler. He'd never drawn unnecessary attention because attention meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant trouble. But Frank wanted people to see what he'd built, wanted them to know he'd surpassed his mentor. So he flaunted it, and federal agents started noticing. Richie Roberts had been watching Frank since that first phone call in 1968. He'd used Frank's information to take down Bumpy's operation, but he wasn't stupid. He knew Frank hadn't handed over that intelligence out of civic duty. Roberts figured Frank was positioning himself to take over, and he'd decided to let it happen, to give Frank enough rope to hang himself. For the next few years, Roberts built a case quietly, methodically, the same way Frank had dismantled Bumpy. He followed the money, tracked the supply routes, identified Frank's lieutenants, documented every shipment. And he waited for Frank to get comfortable, to believe he was invincible, because that's when people made mistakes. The mistake came in 1971. Frank decided to attend the Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden. It was the fight of the century, the biggest sporting event in years, and Frank wanted to be seen. He showed up wearing a full-length chinchilla coat and a matching hat, sitting ringside, surrounded by celebrities and mobsters and politicians. A photographer snapped a picture. It ended up in newspapers across the country, and Richie Roberts saw it. He pinned that photograph to his office wall and circled Frank's face in red marker. That coat became the symbol of Frank's arrogance, the proof that he'd stopped being careful. Roberts intensified the investigation. He got wiretaps approved, flipped a few of Frank's lower-level dealers, started building a conspiracy case that would bring down not just Frank, but his entire organization. What Frank didn't realize was that he'd also made enemies within the criminal world. The Italian families, the ones who'd cut off Bumpy and lost millions when Frank started importing directly from Southeast Asia, they wanted him gone. He'd disrupted a system that had worked for decades, cut them out of profits they considered rightfully theirs. But they couldn't just kill him. Frank had insulated himself well, surrounded himself with loyal shooters, kept moving, kept unpredictable. So the Italians did something smarter. They started feeding information to the same federal agents who were investigating Frank. Not directly, through intermediaries and intermediaries' lawyers. Anonymous tips about shipment dates, warehouse locations, names of corrupt cops on Frank's payroll. The mob and the feds, natural enemies, found common ground in wanting to destroy Frank Lucas. And Frank, blinded by his own success, never saw it coming. Back in Harlem, the consequences of Frank's empire were becoming impossible to ignore. The overdose rate had tripled since Bumpy's death. Crime was skyrocketing because addicts needed money to feed habits that Frank's pure product had created. Families were being destroyed. Children were growing up without parents. The community organizations that Bumpy had quietly supported were struggling because Frank didn't contribute a dime. Preachers started speaking out against the drug trade from their pulpits. Activists started organizing. And the older gangsters, the ones who remembered Bumpy, they started wondering if there was a way to bring Frank down without getting their own hands dirty. The answer came from an unexpected place. One of Bumpy's old lieutenants, a man named Red, reached out to a contact he had in the NYPD. Not to inform, not to betray the game, but to make sure that when Frank fell, and Red believed he would fall, the collapse would be total. Red didn't provide specifics. He just confirmed things the cops already suspected, validated intelligence they'd already gathered. He made sure the net around Frank was tight, and he did it because he believed Frank had violated something sacred. He'd betrayed family, and that, in the underworld, was unforgivable. The walls closed in slowly, then all at once. In early 1975, federal agents executed coordinated raids across New York, New Jersey, and North Carolina. They hit Frank's stash houses, his distribution centers, his family members' homes. They arrested 53 people in a single day. They seized cash, drugs, weapons, and enough documentation to build a case that would put Frank away for life. Frank was arrested at his mansion in New Jersey, pulled out of bed at dawn by agents with automatic weapons. He was charged with conspiracy to distribute narcotics, continuing criminal enterprise, tax evasion, and a dozen other counts. The bail was set at $5 million. For the first time since he'd betrayed Bumpy, Frank Lucas looked scared. The trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors laid out Frank's entire operation in meticulous detail. They showed the jury photographs of the chinchilla coat, played wiretap recordings, brought in witnesses who described Frank's smuggling methods. The defense tried to argue entrapment, illegal searches, unreliable witnesses, but the evidence was overwhelming. Frank's own arrogance had created the trail that led directly to him. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on every count. Frank was sentenced to 70 years in federal prison. He was 44 years old. He'd spent 7 years on top, built an empire worth hundreds of millions, and now he was facing the rest of his life in a cage. And that's when Frank Lucas did the one thing that surprised no one who'd known what he'd done to Bumpy. He decided to cooperate. Frank started talking. He gave up names, dates, locations, methods. He informed on corrupt cops, crooked prosecutors, mob connections, fellow dealers. He provided testimony that led to dozens of additional arrests and convictions. In exchange, his sentence was reduced. He'd serve 15 years instead of 70. It was the same play he'd used against Bumpy, the same ruthless calculus. Sacrifice everyone around you to save yourself. And it worked. But it also cemented his legacy. Frank Lucas wasn't just the man who'd betrayed Bumpy Johnson. He was the man who'd betrayed everyone. The man who proved that loyalty, honor, and respect meant nothing when weighed against self-preservation. The streets called him a rat. Even other informants looked down on him. Because there's betrayal, and then there's what Frank did. Systematic, comprehensive, without remorse. He was released from prison in 1981, went back in 1984 for trying to restart his operation, got out again in 1991. By then, he was in his 60s, broke, forgotten. The empire was gone, the money was gone. Most of the people he'd known were dead or wanted nothing to do with him. He lived in relative obscurity, doing occasional interviews where he'd brag about his past, inflate his importance, rewrite history to make himself look better. He claimed he'd been like Robin Hood, claimed he'd helped the community, claimed Bumpy had been grooming him to take over. All lies. But lies that some people believed because Frank was still a hustler, still working angles, still trying to profit off a legend he'd built on someone else's corpse. Frank Lucas died in 2019. He was 88 years old. His death barely made the news. There was no big funeral, no hundreds of mourners, no legends coming out to pay respects. He died the way men like him always die, alone, forgotten, a cautionary tale that nobody wanted to remember. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson's legacy continued to grow. Books were written about him, movies featured him. Harlem still spoke his name with a mix of reverence and respect. Because in the end, it wasn't about who won the battle. It was about who won the war for memory, for meaning, for the right to be remembered as something more than a hustler. Bumpy became a symbol. Frank became a footnote, and that, more than prison or poverty or death, was the real punishment. To be erased from the story he'd tried so hard to dominate. The old men in Harlem, the ones who'd lived through it all, they understood what had really happened in those 7 days in November 1968. Frank hadn't just destroyed an empire, he'd destroyed a model. Bumpy had shown that power could coexist with principle, that you could be a gangster and still maintain codes, still protect people, still matter beyond the money. Frank had proven the opposite, that power without principle was just greed, that winning without honor was just surviving, and survival, they knew, wasn't the same as living. The story of Frank Lucas betraying Bumpy Johnson became more than just crime history. It became a parable, about ambition unchecked, about loyalty betrayed, about the cost of reaching the top by standing on the body of the man who'd lifted you up. And every generation that came after learned it, internalized it, used it to understand that in the game, the people closest to you are often the most dangerous. Not because they have the means to destroy you, but because you've given them the opportunity. Bumpy Johnson had trusted Frank Lucas, had seen potential where others saw just another hungry hustler from the South, had opened doors, shared knowledge, provided protection. And Frank had taken all of it and used it as ammunition. That was the lesson. That was the warning. Trust is a blade that cuts both ways, and the man you're teaching might be learning how to kill you. Harlem never forgot. And in the decades that followed, when young hustlers rose up and older ones fell, people always asked the same question. Is this another Frank Lucas situation? Is history about to repeat? Because the betrayal of 1968 had shown that empires don't fall from external pressure. They collapse when someone on the inside decides they'd rather rule the ruins than serve the kingdom. And once that decision is made, once that phone call is placed, once that first domino falls, there's no stopping it. Just 7 days from power to grave, from mentor to memory, from empire to ash.